I'm going to talk with you tonight about desegregation and the beginnings of integration. And I'm still in the middle of learning about it. So in a sense, this is as much a research report as it is an inquiry of anything you might have to share with me afterwards or during the questions or whatever. I have learned far more about race than I thought I would so easily, but yet I have numerous questions that I'll raise in the talk, and I'll talk with you. I even, some of you are very unused to me doing this, brought my notes. I may look at stuff and actually refer to it instead of making it up tonight. I also will tell you ahead of time I may mispronounce names just because I read about it in the newspaper doesn't mean I know what it sounds like. That's a play upon Will Rogers in a sense. So when you write about race, particularly in one community, you can't avoid stepping on some toes, because it's not particularly the nicest subject to write about, regardless of whose perspective you tell it from, whether it's the white, the rich, the poor, the male, the female. There aren't particularly nice stories at certain times. On the other hand, when you write about a community, and you write essentially what I call not just a county history, but a community history. You will note in my titles of my books, these are a series about the Catawbans, a people, not a county. They just happen to inhabit something that has county boundaries. You find that the variety of the experiences that Catawba had were as unique to the county as they were general to the country. And so I want to talk to you tonight about the interplay between what you'd expect to hear, the obvious, and what might be the most unusual part of what you would hear, which is the particular stories that I'm learning and I'm fascinated by. So I'm going to start out with a test, and I'm just curious. No one has to pass. Does anyone remember or heard of Taft Broom? Superb. How about E.T. Moore? How about John, and I don't know if he said Gore or Gour. Anybody? Okay. How about Mrs. Marshall Sudereth? I think it was Sudereth. Sudereth? Again, I'd never heard it. Didn't have it in my ear. Well, you all have passed, because these, in my mind, are some of the great heroes of Catawba history. Now, why are they? Because, and I've left a few out, I'll come back to them, because they, in their own way, working within their own community, took their own community values to create a life not only for themselves, but for the people who followed them, not so much under the greatest of adversities, but in fact under lesser adversities, which in some ways were just as hindering. And that's sort of what I'm going to talk with you about first. So I'm not here to tell you about the Ku Klux Klan, because at least before 1965, and that's where I'm so far in my research, there is no true evidence of Klan activity in Catawba County. Now, I do know it will come later, after the civil rights demonstrations, but as far as the point at which you get to the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act in 1965, you simply don't see in the paper widespread Klan organization, nor anything like that. In fact, in 1951, there was a little bit of noise about the Klan, and the City Council of Hickory passed a resolution saying the Ku Klux Klan is not welcome in this community. And in fact, after that point, you don't see anything about it particularly at all, except other places. The Hickory Daily Record loved to tell you what Klans were doing elsewhere, but never particularly told you about what was going on in Hickory. Now that also is a theme I found, because one of the things that you see with racism and racial divide in Catawba County is that it's often the things that go unsaid that tell you what was being said. And therefore it's difficult to come to some conclusion. Now I'll give you an example, and it goes with John W. Gore. He was the reporter for the colored news of Hickory. And Mr. Gifford, the publisher of the Hickory Daily Record, was faithful to publish, whenever it was sent to him, a regular column of what was going on in Ridgeview. And if you want to afterwards, you can come up and see them. They're fascinating. 90% of them are church news or social news, just like white folks. The actual news of Ridgeview wasn't particularly different than the news of Conover or the news of Claremont, both of which was also put in the Hickory Daily Record back then. Who visited who had whose parties. But in doing that, you learn a lot about a community that doesn't particularly get in the news otherwise. So what did these columns tell me about Ridgeview? Well, it told me that the church, the congregation, was central to the core of the community. And these are wonderful stories that shouldn't surprise you of activities that sound just like your activities, of church organizations, of women's clubs, of men's groups, of singing, special singing, and of little nuggets you find, such as the fact that in 1949, a Methodist church in Longview, a white church, held a joint service with one of the churches of Ridgeview. What do I learn? Well, I learned, at least in Hickory, there was social interaction with the standard restrictions of the day in Hickory. Now, what else do I know about that? Well, I also find that if you pay close attention to the names of these organizations, you learn a lot about race relations. They are the Sunshine Club, for example. They have names which denote positiveness, of hope, of striving. If you want to learn about the African American soul, or at least the collective spirit of a community, it's very interesting to see that African Americans had names which talked about a better day, and had activities which were clearly directed towards betterment and preparation for young people, for families, when that day came along. It's all over the Ridgeview News. And it's also part of the fact that you find in Ridgeview, at least, where I find most of the news being written, that they were eager to take any opportunity which would advance that cause. And in turn, what they sought, or at least what they accommodated, what they wanted to go get along with, was white patronage. And Hickory was a patronage city. The whites who ran Hickory, who had the money, made sure that the folks of Ridgeview got the facilities that they wanted. But they always got them, not so much on black terms of quality. In fact, those facilities were pretty good in general, but in time. And this is the most interesting lesson I've learned about race relations in Hickory, and with some element in the rest of Catawba County. Whites would do what blacks sought, but on white time. Everybody get that? It would happen at the pleasure of the whites. And the most vivid of that occurs during the 1950s, when something called the Progressive Club, a long-standing club in Ridgeview, petitioned to white leaders, including the city council, over and over again for a sidewalk down South Center Street. If you go back and you study the American South in the early half of the 20th century, the first half, you go to a place like Kannapolis, or you go to Ridgeview. One of the striking features, if you know to look, is there weren't any sidewalks. Sidewalks are a form of power. They're a form of defining who gets it and who doesn't. And you just see that even today in Kannapolis and the old mill villages. Mr. Cannon, the great paternalist, who would even change your light bulbs for you. You know, I've heard this great story of a little old lady who would call Mr. Cannon personally, and her light bulbs changed. He, of course, would send someone down there to do it. But he never built a sidewalk past her house. And of course, as you know, if you don't have a sidewalk, you're forced to do one of two things. What? Walk in the dirt or walk in the street. If you think about some of our recent troubles, in part it's rooted in the fact that something as simple as a sidewalk is a symbol of equality. And the folks at Ridgeview never gave that up. But they never published an article in the Hickory Daily Record or anything else public that I could see that condemned whites for what they were doing. Rather, they endured, and if you read carefully the colored news, if you will, you will find that they're subtly digging all the time, wanting the sidewalk, asking for the sidewalk, thanking white people for what they give them, but then asking, why is that it? Now, my second example is the Recreation Center, which the moneyed interest of Hickory, through their Recreation Commission, put together in the early 1950s and made it. Ridgeview had a recreation center. Ridgeview had a brick library branch, all of which had been part of the city largesse, and was also the benefaction of Hickory Civic Clubs, including the Altrusa Club, the BPW, the Junior Women's Service League. All those groups made sure that Ridgeview had it. And when they had the official opening, all the white leaders came to it, and the black leaders were there, and everyone was introduced, but a white was the MC. And everyone was happy. And a week later, John Gore says in his column, very subtly at the bottom, he said, and we just had our community opening of our recreation center. In other words, after the white folks left, came the second opening, which was the true celebration of what they were. And so when you study race in this period, when it is in Alabama, and we are in Alabama, and when it is in Mississippi, and it isn't so blatant and so nasty, and I don't find the nasty, you have to look for the subtle. Let me tell you about Conover. Conover had a black section, and twice in the early 1950s, men who were part of that community very properly came to the town council and asked that potholes be filled in the dirt road that led to their neighborhood, and that the crossing was unsafe. One black citizen even had the temerity to tell the council, after all, it's us folks who work for you folks, and you ought to let us get to work better. Best lines I've learned. I am paraphrasing, but essentially he said that. And the Conover Town Board very politely thanked him. And as far as I can tell, did nothing. In other words, part of the way in which power was presented was you thanked them, and then you took your time getting there. Because, of course, in every case, the lesson is who's in charge is going to always remind you who's in charge. I'll go back to Kannapolis to show you how this is as much about class as it is race. I once had lunch with the daughter of Charlie Cannon. Catawba College was sucking up to her to ask for money, of course, and they trotted me down to talk to her, and we were walking in downtown Concord, and she stopped to talk to someone, and I happened to run into someone I knew, so I'm standing here talking to them. And I looked over and I said, well, her name is Hayes. She was Robin Hayes' mother. I said, well, Mrs. Hayes will want to leave soon. I better get over there. He said, son, when Mrs. Hayes is ready to go down the street, she'll inform you. And it wasn't too different. Now, that doesn't mean Hickory was bad or Newton was terrible, but I know virtually nothing about Snow Hill, good or bad, because they never got in the line. Paper. In other words, if my principal sources so far are the news accounts, etc., then fundamentally, I don't know how to tell the story of Snow Hill yet. I know about the churches. I know about some of the leaders. I know that one of their ministers later became the president of the Newton Ministerial Association after civil rights came. I know that the Hickory Daily Record began to run Newton color news, but it's only church news. I don't get that same kind of subtlety. I do find that the O&E eventually began to publish the same kind of accounts from Brown's Chapel Church down on the river near Buffalo Shoals. But again, it's mostly about the wonderful ways in which they work together to help themselves, etc. And I know that these stories are there, but I'm still struggling to find them. And then I have what I consider to be the most interesting thing of all. And here I'll come to what you might have expected me to talk about. And those are the two big events that all of us know as civil rights. These are national events, but they transcended and transformed each one of us. The first one was, of course, the Brown decision in 1954 or 55. Well, that's covered quite well. And in fact, I'll read to you in just a few minutes. It's covered on the front page. And whites, even that time, asked blacks for their reaction. I'll read it to you in just a little bit. And soon after, a black delegation appeared before the county school board, led by the pastor of Liberty Hill Church right outside of Claremont. I was always told it was always outside of Claremont. And asked for the integration of schools, as the Brown decision said. And the school board acted just like Catawba's Act. They were polite, they thanked them, and then they did nothing. And what then, of course, amazes me is that in that polite way, blacks continued to wait. In other words, it's almost like reading the book of Job. Only God isn't quite the nasty guy that he sometimes appears in the book of Job. But fundamentally, they waited. The next great event is the Civil Rights Act of 1964, right? All of you know. I was reading the Hickory Daily Record in Ebony, and I thought, man, I'm going to build this up. They're going to start appearing, they're going to start protesting, and things are going to happen. And sure enough, the Hickory Daily Record is full of it. All stories from Georgia, Mississippi. And by that time, the Daily Record had adopted the only way black people get their name in the paper is if they are criminals. And every criminal in Georgia got its name in the paper. But only one black incident in the entire 5 years I've looked occurred in Hickory. And it, by the way, I think was provoked by whites at a Highland grocery. But blacks did respond with fisticuffs, etc. They had nothing. By that time, the Progressive Club had sort of gone below the radar. I can tell it existed. I can still see that they were meeting, but John Gore no longer wrote the column. I'm still not sure why. I'm working on that. And the different people who followed him simply weren't as subtle. John Gore was an artist. He could embed or text, we're mad, but we're not going to tell you because Mr. Hickory won't let us put it in the paper, he said. But the people who followed him didn't seem to have that gift. And so I still don't quite know the story. Either it was a buildup of frustration, of the lack of any kind of response. I truly can't tell. And the Civil Rights Act gets passed, and it's on the AP wire. You know, President Johnson signs it, and there's nothing. There's nothing. No asking of black folks what they thought. No actual response of any whites. Nothing. And a month later, remember Taft Room? Guess where he gets to go? To Rotary. The Hickory Rotary Club, the inner circle of the inner circle, asked the black man to come talk to him. And you'll love it. About a federal program that's part of Governor Sanford's anti-poverty program. Not about civil rights, but about what's going on with this welfare program. And that's where I am at the moment in terms of reading newspapers. Now, I know what will happen, at least vaguely. Integration will come. There are black students, of course, in Hickory by 65, 66. I've been tracing them. The first one of any note is John Thompson, who becomes an all-conference football player and also has other all-star attributes through the school. But if you look at the Hickory Annual for 66, 67, 68, which I've begun to do, you will see young ladies who were standout stars at Ridgeview High. Student council this, majorette that, and they list their activities, and they get to their senior year, and there's nothing. Yeah, there's nothing. I found a black girl, of course, in the chorus of the band, and one member of the Future Homemakers of America. And by the way, it's very interesting. It's a very slow process of blacks becoming part of the athletic structure. I have yet to look at Newton Conover yet. I'm working on that. I know about Mr. Pearson and all that. That will all be there. But what I'm still puzzled at, and I'm still puzzling through, is the nothing. That the story went dead. After such, and every bit of these notes you see right here, they all predate 1954. And my notes after 1954 on the same subject are minuscule in comparison. So what it means, I'm open to Great debate, great question, etc. But I will read to you first about 5 more minutes, and then we can ask questions. I can go into chapter 2. I'll be right back on the filming. I have to find the right thing. Here we go. By the way, one thing I was actually surprised at, and I'm so old I don't think anyone's surprised me, black faces. The Hickory Exchange Club. For 3 years, from about 1949 to about 1951, every organization in Hickory had a blackface minstrel show, including Lenore Ryan. And then it went away. It was just a blip. It was a very strong blip, if you'd like to look at this. That's the best picture I was able to find. So I'm going to read to you, and then we can talk a while, essentially what is going on. Well, what happens is when the Brown decision is read out, the Newton paper sends out the intrepid reporter, let's go ask black kids what they think. So what do you think black people say? Well, according to the O&E, 2 students at Catawba Rosenwald School in Catawba were asked if they would like to change and go to the white school there. Their answers were prompt and in unison. No, we'd rather stay here. The Catawba Rosenwald School is considered one of the outstanding units in the state. By the way, that was true, with departments equal to those of the whites in the county, and a faculty long recognized for its cooperation and resulting progress in the county school system. And in fact, that is true. If you don't know about Catawba Rosenwald, it is one of the great stellar stories of Catawba history, in part because it had such a sense of community enrichment. And there were a number of teachers there, but the most important one was R.G. Wright, who was a nationally renowned agriculture teacher, who not only taught agriculture to students, but had a counterpart with the home ec department, but also ran the counter to the county fair. You might remember, why did you go to the county fair in Hickory in the 1940s and 50s? To look at your ribbons, to display your cows. And no black person ever got a cow in the county fair. So what did Mr. Wright do? He ran the community fair at Catawba Rosenwald. And on average, 90 different people took home ribbons. In other words, inclusiveness. Ranking, but inclusiveness. His dairy program, which was a kind of black version of 4-H, actually was so well regarded that NC State publicized it in a statewide magazine it put out in 1956. I'll include that in the book. We're actually going to run a picture of the article so that you can see just how prominent he and his students were. What was he promoting? Well, he was promoting the exact values that Catawbans were proud of. Self-reliance, diligent advancement, family cohesion, community cooperation. If you go look at what Catawba Rosenwald was doing for decades, and you take away the attribute black, it sounds just like everybody else in Catawba County. In fact, it may have been the best place in Catawba County in terms of what Catawbans, at least as I argued in my first 2 books, said about themselves as to what they wanted. And in fact, that's what fascinates me about this. In a weird way, Catawba County seemed to have attempted equal, all the while making sure you kept what? What's the other side? Separate. In other words, it's very obvious in most of the South that equal was a joke. Okay? You know that. My favorite story in South Carolina was the fact that essentially facilities in black schools were 1/10 the quality of white. And that was kind of true here. Mr. Pearson, who was the principal at Central High School here in Newton, once told a story about one of the Shufords. There are lesser Shufords and more Shufords, and I'll let you guess which one. That's how I keep them straight. I don't live here, you know. And what he wanted was a refrigerator for the cafeteria. He didn't have a cafeteria. They had to put the milk in a bucket and in ice. This was 1949. And the school board member said, "You must think you're a pretty smart fellow."
And soon after that, Central High School began to get better facilities. But at whose pace? The white pace. But what I find remarkable is when you scratch white Catawbans, at least in the 50s, they believed they had to start acting to the equal side. And you see this particularly in the work of L.L. Moss, who was the chairman of the county commissioners in the early 1950s. And he was the chair, he was a banker in Hickory, that shouldn't shock you. And he realized that with the baby boomers coming of age and going to school, that schools were going to bulge at the seams. They were literally cracking. St. Stephen's actually had 4 classrooms in its auditorium. They actually used the nurses' station as a classroom. And so what Moss did was gather all the journalists and half the county officials, and he went on a caravan to every school in the county to find out what they needed. And to his credit, he went to every black school and he told the truth. And what was the truth? Well, they were terrible. The worst one was Maiden, where they still had a pot-bellied stove that was 50 years old, heating 3 rooms. There were 3 rooms, there was 1 stove. And so you know what the parents of Maiden School did after the Brown decision in '54 and after Mr. Moss and his delegation came? They petitioned to the county commission to give them an equal school. The county had just finished building the new Maiden High School a mile away. They didn't ask to go there. They asked to have their own version of that school, which then the white folks took their time doing, essentially. And so what I'm learning is fundamentally the process whereby race is subtle, is it not? It's a matter of who gets what sidewalk when and how you talk with one another. And so you will notice I've not come in and told you about much violence or much direct confrontation, but I have told you about several things, which I'm very proud I'm figuring out and I'm still assessing. If you study African American history in Catawba, you come away with what I've been thinking for 20 years. Catawbans are remarkable people, and it really doesn't matter what color they are. Their black folks are just as remarkable as anyone else. What's my tidbit? In 1952, the African American teachers in Hickory had a higher level of education on average than white teachers statewide, and a higher level than Claremont High School. Half of them had gone to Winston-Salem State, the other half had gone to B&T, by the way. You see, when you study Ridgeview, it's just like studying Balls Creek. When you study Catawba Rosenwald, you are studying what this county's like. And that's the story I want to tell. Now, the good, the bad, and a lot of ugly is still there. And I suspect as I get into part 2, that's post-1965, as many of you know, there will be confrontations, there will be violence, there will be problems with integration. But the whole project was designed to have me in 1965 at Labor Day, and look at me, I'm 3 days ahead. I'll stop. This is my 30-minute mark. I'll let anybody ask questions, add an anecdote. If I don't know, I'll tell you. I was surprised, for example, to find out that until the mid-50s, and the Brown decision came along, Ridgeview held Emancipation Day services. Every January 1st, they celebrated their heritage. And in that way, they were no different from Balls Creek. Anybody wants to start? Yes?